Hey guys, what's up? It's Savannah. Welcome back to my channel and welcome back to another episode of Halloweek. Today's video we are talking about another serial killer, one that you guys have been requesting for a while, so I'm really excited that we get to sit down and do this. Today we're talking about a very well-known serial killer. For today's video we are talking about the serial killer Ted Bundy. So Ted Bundy was a serial killer back in the 1970s, and today I'm going to run you through a timeline of his life as well as a lot of his killings. And I can almost guarantee that this is going to be a very long video, so grab a snack, get ready, because there is a lot of information. And I also want to mention, if there's anything that I don't mention that you think is important information, make sure you comment it down below. That way we can all be equally informed. And without further ado, let's just jump right on into it. Ted Bundy was born on November 24th of 1946 in Burlington, Vermont. His mother was Eleanor Cowell, who was also known as Louise. Louise was 22 years old when she got pregnant with Ted. And Ted's father was never in the picture, so growing up as a single mother that young was really looked down upon at that time. So when Louise finally had Ted, she moved back in with her parents and they all four lived together. And Ted was actually raised for quite a period of time thinking that his grandparents were actually his parents and that his mother was actually his sister. There was a lot of animosity in the home that Ted was living in growing up with his grandparents. His grandfather was known to be very loud and outspoken and would yell a lot and scream a lot. He was also known to abuse the family dog and just be very violent. So Ted automatically was growing up in not the best household. When Ted was 5 years old, Louise and him moved to Tacoma, Washington. In Washington is where Louise met a man named Johnny Bundy. John Bundy was a war veteran who was also working in a hospital as a chef. Louise and Johnny had several children together. I believe they had 2 girls and 2 boys. Ted was closest with his mother, obviously, as well as his younger brother, Richard. As a young child, even before him and his mother moved to Tacoma, Ted was really fascinated with things that a lot of other people weren't, or a lot of other kids weren't. When Ted was 3, his aunt woke up to knives, kitchen knives, surrounding her that Ted had placed while she was asleep. And that's when Ted was only 3 years old. Ted also preferred to be alone all the time. He preferred to be isolated and alone. That meant with his family and with his friends, he would rather be alone. When Ted found the copy of his birth certificate and saw that unknown was written right next to where his father's name should have been, this brought out a really angry side in Ted and made him want to disconnect from his family completely. As a teenager, Ted was a target of a lot of bullying in school. Ted felt a lot like an outcast and a loner, but regardless of all of that, Ted was very smart and very intellectual. But despite that, in his teenage years, he spent a lot of his time going around and robbing other people, robbing people in their homes. He loved to ski, but it was very expensive for him to ski, so he would go around into other people's houses and steal their ski equipment along with anything else that he wanted. So this became a common trend with Ted's personality. In 1965, when Ted graduated high school, he decided to attend the University of Puget Sound in Washington. After just 1 year, in 1966, he then transferred to the University of Washington. At the University of Washington is where he got into his first serious relationship with the girl of his dreams. Ted met a woman at the University of Washington named Stephanie Brooks. Stephanie was a little bit older than Ted, but that didn't matter to either of them because the two of them hit it off pretty quick and Ted fell hard for Stephanie. In 1968, Stephanie ended the relationship between her and Ted, and this is where Ted just flew into a downward spiral. He was completely heartbroken over the loss of Stephanie, and he also felt very rejected, which sparked a lot of his outrage and his anger for future killings. Ted tried to escape all of the memories that he had with Stephanie by traveling. He traveled to San Francisco and Colorado and Philadelphia because he told his family and his friends because he couldn't be in Washington because he couldn't think of all the memories that he had with Stephanie because it would just make him miss her too much and it was too much for him to handle. 2 years later, in 1970, Ted decided to re-enroll in the University of Washington. He also decided it was time for him to get a job. So the first job he got was at a Safeway store. Then after that, he got a job as a hotel cleaner, like he would wash dishes and things like that, but he was actually fired from that job due to theft. He was accused of stealing things, and so the job had let him go. He also was working for a city councilman. This man was named Art Fletcher, and Art was running to be elected for some position in office. Ted was 100% behind Art every step of the way, trying to get him elected, and really genuinely thought that he was going to get elected. So when Ted found out that Art didn't get elected, that really crushed him and kind of made him feel like he had no purpose because he thought he was really going to excel in the political field because of that. Ted's personality and his behavior really took a turn for the worse. Ted started lurking around the city at night and would peep into people's windows, mainly women, watch them change. Really just weird, odd behavior, as well as he began looking into a lot of violent pornography and just behavior that's pretty questionable. In the fall of 1969, Ted met a woman named Elizabeth Culver. Elizabeth and Ted started dating, and it was really a good thing for Ted because it helped him kind of forget about Stephanie and be able to move on with his life a little bit more. Ted did stretch the truth a lot about his life to Elizabeth, told him a lot of lies about his childhood and just himself in general, but for Ted it was all about feeling normal. Elizabeth had a young daughter, and so he kind of felt like he had a little family and that his life was kind of getting back on track and that he could have a normal life and he would be like everyone else and wouldn't feel so alone. Over the next few months, Ted and Elizabeth's relationship really moved to the next level. They met each other's families. Ted was mainly spending every single night at Elizabeth's apartment, even though he had his own. So Ted was enrolled at the University of Washington and he declared his degree in psychology, which is pretty ironic if you think about it. And he started working another job driving medical supplies. He would be like the delivery man for medical supplies. So he would drive medical supplies from point A to point B, which gave him access to a lot of medical supplies. So keep that in mind. So even though things in Ted's life seemed to be pretty normal, he had a steady relationship, he had a job, he was in school, there was still something inside of him that did not sit right with him. And deep down, he had this fantasy of kidnapping and murdering women. And that fantasy and that urge was becoming stronger and stronger and stronger. So in 1973, Ted was actually accepted into law school, which was amazing. Because of that, he caught the eye of Stephanie Brooks again, his ex-girlfriend that broke his heart. Stephanie saw that Ted was doing so well, so she thought, and really wanted him back. So she approached him and Ted agreed to get back together with her, but not for the reasons that Stephanie thought. Ted only agreed to start dating Stephanie again for his own internal gratification and his own internal payback. He made Stephanie completely fall head over heels for him. He even went as far as asking her to marry him, which Stephanie said yes to. Not too long after that, Ted broke up with her, and the reason he did this is because he wanted Stephanie to feel the pain that he had felt when she broke up with him. He never intended on having a long-term relationship with Stephanie the second time because he was still dating Elizabeth while all of this was happening. This was all Ted's way of just gaining control back and feeling superior. After the breakup with Stephanie the second time, Ted became more active in politics, as well as continuing law school, but despite what seemed to be a cool, calm exterior guy on the outside, because Ted was known to be extremely charming, he was extremely attractive to a lot of women, and he was the guy that everyone liked. Like, everyone liked Ted, everyone thought he was a good guy, and he was easily able to manipulate everyone around him, and no one thought that they had to second guess him at all. But little did they know what was going inside Ted's mind, which was thoughts of these killings and these rapes and these kidnappings that he wanted to carry out. And his odd behavior was increasing at a very, very rapid pace. So that is kind of Ted's life up until his killings started. So let's move on now to the next part, which is his killings in general. Ted Bundy's killings are known to have started in January of 1974. They could have started before then, but no one has been able to confirm that. Ted had this routine of walking around at night, peeping into windows and doing things like that, but this night in particular, he decided to take it to the next level. This particular night, he ended up going to the apartment of the 18-year-old college student named Karen Sparks. Karen was sleeping in her room when Ted entered her apartment. There was like a rod underneath Karen's bed frame that Ted had taken and hit her over the head with until she was unconscious. Ted knocked her unconscious with this bed frame post and then continued to rape her. Fortunately, Karen was able to survive the attack, however, she was left with permanent disabilities. January 31st, 1974, there was a 21-year-old woman named Linda Ann Healy who was at a bar with her friends. The bar was called Dante's and it was a normal college town bar. Her and her friends then went back to her place. She was living with her roommates at the time. I think there were 4 of them living in this house, and so they had all gotten back. And the girls in this house, some of them had keys, some of them didn't, so they would always leave the front door open. Linda slept in the basement of this house. So her and her roommates watched a movie for a little bit, and then Linda decided that she was gonna go to bed, call her boyfriend, and call it a night. So she went down into her room, called her boyfriend, and went to sleep. And that was the last time her roommates or anyone would ever see her again. Linda's work had called her roommates the following day asking why she didn't show up to work, so the roommates decided that they would go into her bedroom, see if she was sleeping, see what the deal was. They found her bed was perfectly made and some of her clothes were missing, and this was extremely unlike Linda's personality. So her roommates decided to call the police, but the police didn't seem too concerned. They thought Linda was 21 years old. Maybe she just went somewhere without telling anyone. It was no big deal. But one of her roommates received 3 phone calls with no one on the other line. So she would answer the phone and no one would say anything on the other line. So police thought that that was a little too close for comfort. That was a little too weird. So they decided to search Linda's room a little bit more. They ended up pulling back Linda's bed sheets and saw blood stains on them. After a little bit more searching, the police were able to kind of put together a theory of what they think happened, which was that someone had came in through that door because it was unlocked, went down into Linda's room, hit Linda over the head until she was unconscious, which is where the blood came from, changed her out of her nightgown that she was in, put her in clothes that he had taken from her closet, and taken her away. Ted Bundy's next victim was a 19-year-old girl named Donna Gayle Manson. So Donna was a little bit more on the rebellious side. She had a wild side to her. She had a carefree side to her. She was always staying out late, wouldn't come home a night or two here or there, but no one really ever thought anything of it. She was known to hitchhike a lot. She was just known to live life on her own terms and didn't really think about the consequences. On March 12th of 1974, Donna left her dorm to go to a jazz concert, which unfortunately she never made it because she ran into Ted Bundy. Donna not coming back to her dorm that night wasn't a huge surprise to her roommate, so they didn't think anything of it, didn't think anything was wrong, and Donna actually wasn't reported missing until a week after her disappearance. A little over a month later, there was a girl named Kathleen Clara d'Olivo who was studying in the library at the university one night. She left the library around 10 p.m. and walked into the parking lot, which is where she saw a man who, little did she know, was Ted, dressed up, kind of looking like a student would, and had his arm in a cast. She saw the man drop his books and he asked if she would help him bring his books to his car. Kathleen said sure. She helped him to his car. Ted was driving a Volkswagen Beetle, and right when they were getting up to his car, Kathleen got a gut feeling that something was very wrong and that she could be in very big danger. So instinctually, she dropped her books and ran in the complete opposite direction and was actually able to escape from what was about to come from Ted. And even though this was amazing for Kathleen, it only angered Ted more and made him want to kill again. So that same night that Kathleen had ran away from Ted, Ted found another woman named Suzanne Elaine Rancourt. Suzanne disappeared on her way back to her dorm room that very same night. So the police were finally starting to notice that there were similarities and just way too close for comfort for all of these disappearances to be coincidental. But because they had never found a body or anything like that, they were still just considering all of these cases missing persons cases and weren't considering the fact that they all could be linked to the same person. So Ted to this day is really well known for the fact that all of his victims looked very similar. All of them had long hair parted down the middle, very similar to Stephanie Brooks. Looking back on all of his victims, all of them have similar qualities that Stephanie had. And overall, once these killings started to take place, the cool, calm, and collected personality that Ted was able to maintain for so long was slowly going away, and people were really starting to notice a change in his personality. Ted was having anger issues and just wasn't himself, and Elizabeth, his girlfriend, thought that he was cheating and having an affair and really wasn't happy with him. He just started becoming very careless. He was skipping shifts at his job, and around this time is when Ted decided that he wanted to expand the horizons of his victims, so that is when he went to Oregon. On May 6th, 1974, Ted's first victim in Oregon was named Roberta Parks. Roberta would often go on walks by herself at night. It was just something she liked to do, and on this particular day, she was having a rough day. She had been fighting with her boyfriend, and she also heard that her father was suffering from medical health problems, so she was really having a hard time, so she decided that she wanted to go for a walk this particular night, and unfortunately she was never seen again. May 31st, 1974, just a couple days later, Ted struck on his next victim named Brenda Carol Ball. Brenda was similar to Donna in the sense that she was very carefree, had a very carefree lifestyle, did things on her own terms, was kind of like a wild card, pretty rebellious. A lot of people believe that Brenda couldn't get a ride that night. She had asked several of her friends and none of them could come and pick her up, and that is when she came in contact with Ted Bundy. Brenda was known to often hitchhike, so it wasn't anything out of the ordinary for her. So people believe that she got a ride from Ted Bundy, and that is the last she was ever seen. Her friends didn't think anything was wrong and didn't report her missing until June 17th. That is 18 days after she first went missing. That is more than 2 weeks, and that is, personally, I think that is insane. But at that point, Ted was already on to his next victim. His next victim was named Ann Hawkins, who was 18 years old and a popular girl at the University of Washington. She had a lot of friends, and she was walking home on June 11th from a sorority party, and she decided to walk home by herself in the well-lit alley, which was the shortcut to her house. She saw a disabled man in the distance. He had crutches and he had dropped his briefcase, and this man asked if she would help him bring the briefcase to his car, so she said yes. The two of them walked back to the Volkswagen Beetle that Ted Bundy owned, and that is when he beat her and then later murdered her. But this time, Ted left evidence. When Ted struck Ann to knock her unconscious, he did it so hard to the point where she lost a shoe and her earrings flew out of her ears. These items were taken in by police and kept as evidence, and it was the first evidence ever from the Ted Bundy murders that was left. So now these murders were getting complete publicity from everyone across the United States, and people were really scared because, especially in Seattle and Oregon, people were very, very scared, thinking that they could possibly be the next victims. And Ted was thriving off of the fact that he was getting all of this attention. Even if no one knew that it was him, he was living off of the fact that he was controlling this whole situation. He was controlling when he would strike and when he would kill, and knowing that the police weren't going to find him. His ego was huge at this point, and he was starting to get very risky with his murders. On July 14th in 1974, and I'm gonna look over here so I get the name right, it is called Sammamish State Park, a little bit east of Seattle, which is apparently where a lot of tourists go. And on this one particular day, there was a woman named Janice Ann Ott. Janice was laying out on the beach this day, and everyone around noticed that there was a man walking around talking to a couple different women, asking if they wanted to go sailboating, and all of them said no. And then once he got to Janice, he sat down next to her, talked to her for a little bit, introduced himself as Ted, and asked her if she wanted to go sailboating a little bit up the road. And after a little bit of them talking, she agreed, so the two of them got in his car, and she was never seen again. Ted drove Janice to a disclosed area, which is where he murdered and raped her. And this was a very unusual circumstance for Ted because this was really the first time anyone knew that he struck during the day. Typically it was at night when it was dark and no one could really see, but this was in plain daylight. So this really told police that he was getting a lot more confident with his murders. And even right after murdering Janice, he went right back to the beach looking for another victim. And around 4:30 p.m. he did just that because he met a woman named Denise. He met Denise Naslund on her way to the restroom, and she had been drinking a little bit that day and she had done drugs a couple hours prior, so she wasn't fully with it and wasn't fully there. And Ted got to talking to her, and all anyone remembers seeing that day who was on that beach is that Ted and Denise walked away together, and that was the last time anyone had seen Denise. I don't want to say the good thing about this, but something that came out of this was that the police were able to finally get a description on the man that they have been looking for, because he was striking in broad daylight and there were lots of people at this beach, so a lot of people had seen what was going on. They were able to describe the man that they had saw, and they were also able to tell police that this man was going by the name of Ted. But still at this point, Ted had not been caught and he was not planning on it. Later in 1974, Ted decided to move to Salt Lake City, Utah. Elizabeth ended up staying back, but the two of them were able to have a long distance relationship. Even with still being in a relationship though, Ted was anything but faithful to Elizabeth because he had dated at least a dozen other women during his time living in Salt Lake City. On September 3rd of 1974, Ted had only been living in Salt Lake for 3 days when the bodies of Janice and Denise were found by a couple hunters in Sammamish State Park. And this is when everything kind of switched, because it was now clear to the police that they weren't just dealing with missing persons victims, they were dealing with homicide victims. Between September 20th and November 8th of 1974, Ted murdered at least 4 women. I'm gonna look over here so I get the names right, but his other victims included Nancy Wilcox, Melissa Smith, Lehi Aim, Deborah Kent, and Susan Curtis. And Ted's MO was starting to switch up a little bit, because instead of getting rid of all the bodies like he typically would, police think that he took the bodies of Melissa and Lehi and kept them for his own satisfaction. They think he went as far as to washing them and putting them in new clothes and putting makeup on them and using them to his personal gratification. So this is when this gets really crazy. So back in Seattle, Elizabeth was reading about all these murders in the paper and things were not adding up for her. So much so so that she actually reached out to the police and tipped them off to the murderer that they were looking for being her boyfriend, Ted Bundy. She told the police that the man that she was dating, which takes so much in her, that the man that she was dating, the man that she claimed to love, which takes so much strength inside of her, could possibly be the person who was committing all of these murders. And the police overlooked what she said and didn't really look at it twice. Every time Elizabeth would see Ted, though, after that, she really didn't mention anything about the killings or her talking to the police in general. She ended up going through the dates of all of the killings and was actually able to put together herself, realizing that Ted was acting normal on those dates, and so she really didn't think that anyone who was acting normal would be able to kill someone. That in her mind gave her a little bit of relief, because in her mind she thought, how could anyone who's been murdering people on these specific dates act quote unquote normal? Ted wasn't showing any odd behavior on those days. So in her mind she felt relieved, thinking that maybe she just looked too much into it and that he had nothing to do with it. Ted decided he wanted to expand his horizons again and ended up traveling to Colorado. And on January 12th of 1965, Ted murdered a woman named Kathleen Eileen Kimball. Kathleen was staying in a resort in Colorado, I believe it was Aspen, and she was staying with her husband and kids when she told her family that she was going downstairs to the lobby to grab something. And she got into the elevator to go back up to her room, but she never made it to her room because right when she was getting off the elevator, Ted was outside of it waiting for her. Karen's body was found 2.5 miles from where the resort she was staying at was about a month later. March 14th, Ted decided to return back to Colorado, which is where he met a woman named Julie. Julie was a ski instructor in Vail, Colorado, and she had been walking home one day when she saw a man struggling to put his ski equipment into his car. This man appeared to be disabled, he had crutches, and asked Julie if she would help him put his belongings into his car, and so she said of course. After helping him get into his car, that was the last time Julie had ever been seen. April 6th, Ted murdered a woman named Denise Oliverson. Ted met Denise while she was biking to her parents' house and dumped her body in the Colorado River. So now there were murders in Colorado, Oregon, and Washington, and police were really coming together and putting together all of their notes and realizing that they were dealing with one specific person. And there was one specific name that continuously kept coming up in all the departments, and that name was Ted Bundy. Ted decided he wanted to expand his horizons again, which is when he traveled to Idaho. Once he got there, he attempted to go into a sorority house, but was stopped by a man who asked who he was, and Ted was pretty startled because he had never been stopped like that before, and this man told Ted that he didn't recognize him, so Ted had to leave, which made Ted extremely infuriated. On Ted's way back to his hotel, he met a 12-year-old girl. This 12-year-old girl was named Lynette Culver. Lynette was walking with her friends outside of school when this occurred, and Ted and Lynette were seen talking, and for whatever reason Lynette got into Ted's car with him, and that is when Ted drove Lynette to his hotel and drowned her in his bathtub. On August 16th of 1975, Ted was actually smoking marijuana in his car, driving around probably looking for another victim, when a police car pulled up behind him and turned his lights on. This freaked Ted out to the point where instead of pulling over, he sped off, which was unsuccessful for him, and he eventually surrendered to the police and was taken into the station on the count of speeding away from the police. And when they were looking in his car, when the police were looking in his car, they found a ski mask, they found women's underwear, they found handcuffs, they found rope, they found all these odd things that just weren't making sense. But they really couldn't hold him on anything, so they ended up releasing him. But on August 21st of 1975, he was arrested again, mainly for the tools found in his car, and he was questioned about them, but they didn't have anything to hold him on, so the police released him again. The police decided that the best way that they could go about this was to get one of the women who was actually able to escape from one of Ted Bundy's attempted attacks. They got in contact with the woman and gave her 2 piles of pictures, one containing vehicles and the other containing people, mugshots. She went through the series of pictures that contained the vehicles and was able to point out Ted Bundy's Volkswagen Beetle. When she went through the lineup of the mugshots, she was also able to point out Ted Bundy. Shortly after his second release, Ted became a little bit frightened, thinking that the police may be catching on to him, so he decided to sell his car to a teenager, which was unsuccessful because the police found it and impounded the car. The police went through and searched the car, and they were able to find hair from some of the victims as well as some splatters of blood. Ted Bundy was arrested and charged for this, but released on a $15,000 bail that was paid off by his mother. So after he got out on bail, he returned back to Seattle with hopes of maintaining a normal life just for a little bit, just to try to make the spotlight not on him anymore, anymore, but in June 1976, Ted was sentenced 1 to 6 years for the attempted attacks that he made on the women who were able to escape from him. Ted was able to con his way out of anyone thinking that there was anything wrong with him or that he would ever be able to commit crimes like this. He was given special privileges in the jail because people just thought he was so nice and such a good guy and thought that he was just being wronged for something that he didn't do. Ted was moved from one prison to another, and the second prison he ended up at was called Glenwood Spring Jail. In June of 1977, Ted asked the police officers if it was okay if he went to the library to do some research on his case, and the officers said sure. They let him go, and once he was in the library, he actually opened the window and jumped out from the second floor all the way to the ground. He escaped for 6 days, but was then found and brought back into custody by the police. Ted knew that he wanted to escape again, but this time it took a little bit more concentration and a little bit more effort. Ted was able to lose 35 pounds, and on December 30th, 1977, he cut a hole through the ceiling in his cell and was able to climb through it and escape. No one noticed that Ted was missing for about 17 hours, which gave him plenty of time to leave, and by that time, he was actually already in Chicago. Ted says his initial intention when leaving and escaping was to blend in with society, get a normal job, just because he didn't want to go back to prison, but he says shortly after he escaped, his urges to kill came right back. So Ted then went to Florida, and a lot of people believe Ted decided to go to Florida because of a conversation he had with his attorney. So I read a couple articles that said that Ted had a conversation with his attorney, and this conversation was basically Ted asking his attorney where in the United States uses an electric chair as a form of punishment for the death penalty. His attorney then told him that he believes Florida was the only state left that used the electric chair. And the electric chair was something that really fascinated Ted. It was something that he really wanted for whatever reason. The thrill of it really excited him, and that's why a lot of people believe he actually ended up in Florida. January 15th of 1978, Ted went to the Florida State University and visited the Chi Omega sorority house. I'm gonna look over here so I get their names right. At this house, he murdered Margaret Bowen and Lisa Levy, and then he attacked Catherine Kleiner and Karen Chandler. I know that this is the second time I'm like importing a video from my computer into like one of my real videos, and I'm sorry for that, but I want to talk about something that I forgot to mention that I know a lot of you are probably going to bring up, and that is the famous bite mark. So what really led to the conviction of Ted Bundy was this bite mark that he left on Lisa Levy. There was no weapon found at the scene, there was nothing, but the one thing that the police were able to find was a bite mark. They used this bite mark and measured it with a ruler and did all of these things. So what the police ended up doing is they ended up asking Ted Bundy for like a dental sample of his teeth and to get like an imprint of them to see if they would match the bite mark, which he refused to do. And so the police actually ended up having to do like a surprise visit on him. They got a warrant for it, and then the police kind of blindsided him because they didn't want him grinding his teeth or doing anything that would shred his teeth down to make it not a match. And so they ended up getting the dental sample, and that is what came up positive, and that's how they were really able to convict him of this crime. After he left the sorority house, he went into Cheryl Thompson's apartment and murdered her. Instead of going by the name Ted like he usually did, he was actually now going by the name Chris. But when police arrived onto the scene, they noticed that there were way too many similarities and knew that this was the act of Ted Bundy. A couple days after this attack, Ted stole a van from someone's house and decided to drive all the way to Jacksonville, Florida. One day after stealing this van, 12-year-old Kimberly Leaks went missing from Jacksonville, and her body was found shortly after that. And 3 days after the murder of Kimberly Leaks, an officer named David Lee actually pulled over the van that Ted Bundy had been driving. David found in this van 3 stolen IDs and 21 stolen credit cards, so he arrested Ted Bundy. When Ted was arrested, he told the police that he was not going to tell them anything unless they gave him a 2-hour phone call. In that 2-hour phone call, he spent it talking to Elizabeth, telling him he was sorry for what she was about to see on the news and that he was sick and couldn't control himself. Ted just wanted control. This whole thing, this entire thing, was Ted being in control of his life because he thought for throughout the entirety of it, he wasn't. Through his childhood, he felt out of control with his own life and with his relationship with Stephanie and her breaking his heart and all of that. Like, this was all him controlling his life, and that's the way he saw it, and that's what he thrived off of, and that's the adrenaline he got. Ted rejected a plea bargain deal that said that he would get life in prison if he pleaded guilty to the murder of the Chi Omega house. Like I said, he rejected this plea deal, and then on July 24th of 1979, Ted Bundy was sentenced to death. Ted Bundy died January 24th of 1989 by the electric chair at the Florida State Prison. And that is really all the information I have for you guys. I want to know your opinions about it. I know it's a solved case and I know it's a serial killer case, but I really enjoy reading your guys' guys' opinions on these different people and why you think they did the things that they did. So definitely leave those in the comments below. I hope you guys enjoyed another episode of Halloweek, and I will be back tomorrow for another one. So bye guys.